Hi, welcome, and thank you for tuning in. To begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We recognize and acknowledge the people, the culture, and history that make up our community. I hope you will join us where you are in reflection and in action as we connect on native land. I'm Meg Jackson-Fox, the Associate Curator of Academic and Public Programs at the Center for Creative Photography in the Arizona Arts Division at the University of Arizona. Before turning over to my conversation with Abdul Aziz, I'd like to send a warm thank you to our CCP Directors Circle and CCP members whose support makes programs like this possible. If you'd like to learn more about joining as a member or to sponsor our work in other ways, please visit our website at ccp.arizona.edu. It's my most sincere pleasure to introduce Abdul Aziz, freelance photojournalist, filmmaker, and serial entrepreneur. For nearly 2 decades, Aziz has worked to document conflict, war, social issues, and culture spanning the globe from the Middle East and Africa to the far reaches of the Himalayas. His photos have been published by opinion-leading news agencies worldwide. Most recently, his work is focused on the rise of white nationalism in the United States and the removal of Confederate monuments in cities at the center of the debate, such as New Orleans and Charlottesville. Aziz is a 2021 recipient of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities Documentary Photographer of the Year Award, which recognizes photographers whose work captures Louisiana's history, culture, and/or peoples. With past experience working in Somalia and the Gaza Strip, Aziz has more recently trained his lens on the modern-day struggle for civil rights and racial justice in Louisiana. His photos of the tense scenes that accompanied the removal of Confederate monuments in New Orleans in 2017 and of Black Lives Matter protests across the state in the last 3 years document an often unflattering but always critically important moment in contemporary Louisiana life. And with that, here is my conversation with Abdul. Abdul, I'm so excited you're joining us for this conversation, most especially amidst all you have going on right now. So from beginning as a documentary filmmaker at 21, I hoped you might share some images and insights from a selection of projects that led to where your photography is today.
Sure, and I also too want to first acknowledge the indigenous land that I currently am on, that was previously known as Bobuncha, the land of many languages here in New Orleans, Louisiana. So thank you for having me, Meg. I'm very excited to be here. I want to talk a little bit about how I got my beginning, how I got my start at the age of really, I would say 19 years old, 18 or 19 years old. If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to share my screen really briefly. All right, and are you seeing that okay?
I am.
Excellent.
Perfect.
So my name is Abdul Aziz, as Meg so beautifully put it. I currently document conflict and war primarily as a photojournalist, but as of recent, I've been training my lens more on environmental racism, as well as focusing on the pandemic. I got my start at a very young age. I was a student at Loyola University here in New Orleans. And I bought my first, what was called then a digital high-8 camera, which had high-8 tapes. And this was around the time that the original iMac was released. So I fancied myself shooting some short films around campus with friends, even though my major was political science at the time. And it had absolutely no background whatsoever in filmmaking. I fancied myself a filmmaker. I actually bought the camera and started filming magic shows for a group of magicians I was hanging out with in the French Quarter of New Orleans. And one of those magicians worked for a company called Haunted History Tours in New Orleans, which gives historic or haunted tours of spaces in New Orleans that are deemed to be haunted. And he told me, my boss really wants to get a video done. You do such a great job on these magic videos. We'd really love for you to potentially help my boss figure out a way to make a short documentary about all the stories that we tell. I said, sure, absolutely, I can do that. I had only my high-8 camera and I did not have my iMac as of yet. So it was completely conjecture in the sense that I had absolutely no idea how I was going to be able to accomplish or achieve any of those things. I just jumped head in. So I met with his boss at Harris Casino, which I snuck into at the young age of 19 years old, to go to this meeting. And subsequently, he agreed to hire me for this project. And he said, well, what do you need to get started? And I said, well, at the time, let me back up. I'd been looking at this new interchangeable lens digital camera called the Canon XL1, which was really making waves. I had no business owning a Canon XL1 because I didn't know how to use it. But that's the camera that I was determined to own. So I'd probably about a week before gone to a local camera shop in New Orleans on Canal Street and saw that the camera was available for about $5,000. So at the time, I said, how am I going to get $5,000? So when he asked me what I need to get started, I said, we can start for about $5,000. So he wrote me a check right then and there, which to my surprise, and I walked to a check cashing place, cashed it, walked to the camera shop. All of this was in about a 3-block area of each other. And I had $5,000 in cash in my pocket. And I said to the owners of the camera shop, look, I only have $5,000. I don't have the tax, but I'll give you $5,000 in cash if you give me that camera. And lo and behold, they agreed. And I went home with my Canon XL1. And then I decided that I needed a crew and I needed lights and I needed reflectors and all of those types of things. So I called all of my friends, all of my best friends who happen to be living here, some from Alabama where I went to high school, and some friends that I had met while I'd been in college. And they all agreed to be a part of my crew. And we started production. So the photo that you're looking at here is that first Canon XL1 on a tripod with my friend Aaron operating it and me standing behind him, and my friend Tiny there using our halogen lights and diffuser to film a scene in what's called Pirates Alley. This was really exciting for me. It was kind of a dream come true to have the opportunity to do that. So we wrapped this film. It takes me about 7 months to finish because, once again, I'm not a filmmaker and I have no idea what I'm doing whatsoever. And I kept adding equipment as I would get paid, which was very exciting. So by the end of it, I had a studio full of equipment, which was very exciting. So the film ends. Travel Channel comes to New Orleans and says, we want to do a small documentary about the haunted stories. The owner of Haunted History Tour at the time, excuse me, that was my mail coming in. The owner of Haunted History Tours at the time contacted me and said, you know, Travel Channel wants to come down and shoot, but I just told them, why don't we use your footage? And I'm going to put you in touch with them and see what you guys can work out. So they contact me and they say, hey, can we use your footage? And I'm like, are you going to pay me? And they're like, absolutely not. But the idea of having my footage seen by millions on the Travel Channel was just too intoxicating to turn down. So I said, please just keep me in mind in the future if there's something that I'd like to do. Fast forward, someone who was in this film, a guy by the name of Jamel, knew a woman who owned the same cameras, Canon XL1. She had just bought 3 Canon XL1s herself. She was a Buddhist, and she contacted me and said, hi, I am interested in going to Nepal to film a documentary on Everest. And I'm looking for camera people. I'm looking for folks who can help me learn how to use this camera properly and be a part of the crew. Is that something that you'd be interested in? And I was like, absolutely, yes. So it was a very exciting prospect. We had a few meetings, subsequent meetings, and lo and behold, before you knew it, we were in Kathmandu. And we were in Nepal for 6 months, actually, kind of filming the climbing season, as well as doing some other documentaries in and around Kathmandu. So I remembered my connection in my request to the Travel Channel, and I said, hey guys, guess what? We're going to Nepal. We're doing this documentary. Don't you guys want to pay for it? And they were like, no, you can fund it yourself. And if we like it, we'll buy it from you. So we took a crew of about 5 people to Nepal for 6 months, and we filmed in and around Kathmandu. And kind of in the middle of that, we decided to go to Everest, which was initially the goal. But the documentary essentially was about Buddhism and Sherpa culture in the Everest region. which was something so far into me, so far away from the things that I knew, having grown up primarily in the United States most of my life. But I just was ecstatic about the idea to have this opportunity to explore another culture, to explore another religion. And not only that, but to go to Mount Everest, right? Prior to this, I hadn't been in the mountains. I had never really spent any time in any type of mountain. And here I was on the path to summiting Everest. So this photo was taken while I was in Nepal with one of our Sherpas, who we also recruited to be our sound man at the time. His name was Karma Sherpa, and it was really just an incredible experience. This is in Maratika Cave. This really, really encouraged me to understand why it's so important to document these issues, why it's so important to, one, understand and respect the cultures in which you're entering into, and tread lightly in the sense that you are in this space, you're allowed to be in this space, but you have to do so respectfully. Now, I was a 19-year-old hotshot, well, 20 years old at this point, a 20-year-old little hotshot. And, I just thought I could, off the heels of having some footage on Travel Channel, I could just walk into a room with my camera, not say anything to anyone, and just start shooting. Well, we did this during a mandala ceremony, where it's a very intricate stand ceremony that builds this beautiful mandala. And there was a tulku, or a lama, who was there as I walked in, and just kind of started, stomping my big feet around and just taking the shots that I wanted to, disrespectfully, without really considering what it meant to have respect and honor for the individuals that I'm documenting. Not necessarily intentionally was I trying to do that, but I was just trying to catch the best shot that I could, until this tulku stopped the ceremony and yelled at me. And I remembered that moment. I held on to it for the rest of my life, because it really made me understand, wait a minute, this isn't my space. This isn't my culture. These aren't people that know me. I'm entering into this space, and I'm as far in as it could get in Nepal at the time. This big guy just kind of stomping around in the midst of this beautiful ceremony that was deserved to be respected. And it's a moment that I held close to me for the rest of my life. I also was just inspired by just the absolute beauty of Nepal, and of course of Everest. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. It opened me not just to the idea of respect for other cultures, but to really exploring in depth what makes people work in the ways that they do, what makes people do the things that they do the way that they do them. So I was extremely excited and extremely honored by the end of my 6 months to have had the opportunity, and also had my 21st birthday on Everest, which was
amazing.
Just probably one of the greatest experiences ever. But again, the landscape just completely was awe-inspiring, as were the people and the individuals, mostly the people and the individuals who we were telling the stories of. And that really is what sparked my love and my passion for storytelling. Now, fast forward to 2008, I was working for an organization called the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana. I was the director of communications there. And 2008, of course, as you may remember, was the time that the financial crisis hit the United States. So my work was being funded, and as all nonprofit work did at that time, funders began pulling out because there just simply wasn't any money left. So I was laid off from that job. About 2 weeks prior to that, I'd watched a film about prolific war photographer Jim Noctway, called War Photographer. And I was enamored. I was absolutely enamored at the power. Now, coming from a documentary filmmaker background, and let me just back up just a little bit again. I went on to make a number of documentaries for Travel Channel, or for Discovery Networks. So some of them were on Animal Planet, Travel Channel. And we had a wonderful opportunity. We dug into primarily esoteric and spiritual practices worldwide. So in Morocco, we visited a group of Sufis called the Ganawa. In Ireland, we visited the Fellowship of Isis, which was a coven of witches. And, so we really wanted to dig into those stories and tell those beautiful stories about the individuals who are engaged in other things that are seemingly far into a lot of Westerners.
Mm.
So I watched this film, War Photographer, and I said, it changed my life. It really changed my life. The idea and the concept that a single image could change the course of a war, or change the course of public discourse, and the idea that a single image could be and have so much power behind it. It was something that just really blew my mind. And the work is critical. It was critical work, right? These were moments that were watershed moments in the history of all of these wars, whether they be Vietnam, whether they be the Balkans, whether they be, you know, Central Africa. It's important to tell these stories through these images and allow for people to have an emotional and empathetic connection to what's actually happening in all of these places. So I say all that to say, my next step was I got laid off, and I received a pretty decent severance package. And then 2 weeks later, I was in the Gaza Strip. I decided to get on a plane and fly to Egypt and cross over through Egypt during Operation Cast Lead, which was the 2009 excursion into the Gaza Strip by the Israeli Defense Forces. So this wasn't my first time in conflict zones necessarily. I'd spent some time as a filmmaker in Somalia. I'd spent some time documenting other parts of the Middle East and Central Africa, but as a filmmaker, not as a still photographer. But I really wanted to tell the story through still imagery because I'd been so inspired by Jim Nachtwey's documentary. So as I said, I went into the Gaza Strip to document the war as it was happening. And I had an opportunity. One of the things that I feel was most important to me was to connect with people in a genuine and honest way. So before I ever took out my camera, I spent time with individuals. I spent time getting to know the people on the ground. I spent time talking to people about the issues and having a deeper understanding of what it is that they're actually experiencing. I would go to political talks. I would go to unsavory organizations and groups that have been painted as terrorist organizations, such as Hamas or Islamic Jihad, and really try to gain a deeper understanding of who the people were behind these masks. And really, I think for the first time, understood that these are normal people for the most part, right? Like these are doctors, lawyers, these are people who are in their homeland trying to defend it from their perspective. And that at night, they're not the boogeyman or these horrible individuals that we like to push into media narratives often, but that they have families, they have children that they love, they have things that they want to do in life and live their lives, right? And I mean, that's on all sides, right? So it gave me the opportunity to really dig into kind of the psyche and the idea of resistance in a way that I hadn't previously had an opportunity to see. So one evening, I was at a talk with the women of Hamas. It was entitled The Women of Hamas, which was really shocking for a lot of folks to find out that there is a significant amount of women leadership in Hamas. And the doctor had invited me to his home for dinner that night. But as we were wrapping up the conversation, the political conversation and discourse, I saw two men talking to the doctor I was supposed to be going home with. And he said, came over to me and said, unfortunately, I can't take you for dinner this evening because they have other plans for you. And of course, at the time, I'm just like, what do you mean by other plans? Like, what does that mean exactly? Can you please specify what does other plans mean? What are those other plans? So I got into a vehicle with two men and two of the women who had spoken that evening. The windows were completely blacked out with like cellophane of some sort, some type of plastic black wrapping, not tent, but just there were like two holes cut out, like one on the side and the windshield so the driver could see. And we drop off the women, and Slowly but surely, the lights start disappearing. Now we're driving around the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is about 29 miles long. And so we're driving for about 2 hours, just in a circle. So I'm getting more and more nervous as time passes. And then the lights kind of go. And then I realize I'm at the front. I'm at the front of the war, of where the IDF is conducting their operations and where the Izzedine al-Qassam brigades are conducting their operations. And they make me jump out of the car, and they're like, as soon as I get out of the car, I'm met with a line of men that have RPGs and AK-47s, and all of them have different representations, political representations, affiliations. Some of them were from Hamas, some of them were from Fatah, some of them were from Islamic Jihad, and it was just kind of like this coalition force, makeshift coalition force that was going to the front. And they take me on this very dramatic photographing tour. And for me, I wanted to tell the story without compromising their positions. If I was following these photos, I didn't, necessarily want to give away their exact locations. I also didn't want them to think that I was a spy by doing such, which is why we went indoors and took some of these photographs. As you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner of that photo, you can kind of see elements of the wall. But I pushed I pushed it at like 2 or 3 stops, so it would appear as if it was taken on a white background. Now, meanwhile, we're inside the house with an RPG, which stressed me out considerably. But nonetheless, after we walked away from this, they then took me to their home for dinner. And that's really when I really got an opportunity to see what their family life was like, right? Like I had this opportunity to connect with them on a level that otherwise I probably would have never. When we walked into the house and they took off their masks, they took off their vest and laid down the vest that had grenades and magazines for their AK-47s in it, and put the RPG in the corner and, unwrapped. And the first thing that I remember walking into the house was seeing this teddy bear sitting on top of the television with a heart on it, right? And then the kid running out of the back and being happy to see their father come home, right? And everything that I had experienced with those individuals at the front was a complete departure when they were at home, right? They were just loving fathers, they were loving brothers, and it was a moment for me to remember the humanity, right? And to try to tell these stories from a place of humanity, even if whether I agree or not with what the activity is that's going on. So this was another moment in which I believed that empathy plays a major role in terms of telling these types of stories, right? We want to make sure that individuals have an opportunity to understand we're all human. We all have these human aspects to us, right? Now there are some parts of it that, are obviously unsavory and not good, right? But nonetheless, deep down inside, the humanity is what we're trying to appeal to. The humanity is what we need to show. And why is it that someone feels the need to brandish an RPG in a living room, right? This image is particularly important to me because, I call it the great irony. You look at this individual and he's wearing a US Army shirt, right? Wow. He has an airborne patch on, right? Yet the bombs that destroyed his home that are behind him and killed his family, which were still in the building at the time, were American-made bombs, right? So it was a fascinating kind of juxtaposition of reality for me in that moment. And then also just the children, right? We think about what we want for our kids here. We think about, the safety that we are very privileged to have, and where we're not running and ducking from white phosphorus or bombs every day. And it's just important to connect with those individuals in that way. And I remember connecting with this young man and just having a conversation with him about what it means to be in somewhat of an open air prison, right? And what are his hopes, what are his wishes, what are his desires? Because that's one of the other things, despite the fact that we find individuals in states of conflict, sometimes in states of desperation, it doesn't mean that they don't have aspirations, right? It doesn't mean that they don't believe and they don't have the faith that things will change and that their condition, it's possible to change their condition, which is why you find so many people joining, movements or now, and at the advent of citizen journalism, even telling their own stories, right? Which is
Right.
also super important. So, and then I really started focusing my lens on domestic conflict. So
I wanted to ask you, you're talking about this decision that you made when you had a change in your career, right? And you saw this opportunity to go to the Gaza Strip. And it doesn't have to be about that necessarily, but really you could have gone to so many different places in the world at that moment, right? And continue to right now. I'm thinking specifically as you're going through these slides of Sudan currently and the images coming out of Sudan, even though that they're, trying to suppress Wi-Fi and trying to suppress kind of circulation of those images. To your point about the power of images, are there particular stories that draw you specifically to want to be a part of telling those stories?
sure. I think that all of us have an interest in telling stories that also matter to us. Well, not all necessarily, but for me, that's the way it is, right? Like, I feel there are stories that resonate with me. There are political situations and pockets and individuals in specific communities that have always either intrigued me or that I find myself feeling some sort of empathy for, right? Like, or there are individuals or organizations that I want to document because I have a personal connection to them, right? Like, it's, for instance, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has always been something that's been interesting to me. I come from a background, I grew up in a Hasidic Jewish community in New York. So, Israel has always been at the forefront of my mind. And I wanted to tell the story from the other side, though, right? I could have flown, to Israel and embedded with the IDF if I chose to, but I wanted to know the other side. And oftentimes in my work, my purpose is to tell the side of the story that doesn't receive the embed, right? Like, you don't get to hear from the voices of Hamas just because nobody wants to go and hang out with Hamas for like 3 months, like, you don't have an opportunity to hear the side of, not that, it's the right thing that they're saying, but you don't have the opportunity to hear the side of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Because nobody wants to go hang out in the woods with the KKK for months, or put their lives in danger in such a way. But I've always felt compelled to tell stories from an honest perspective, right? Like, from a non-biased, honest, in a non-biased and honest way. Because I feel that is ultimately what the integrity of journalism should be, right? Like, we should be telling stories. We shouldn't necessarily be slanting stories for political gain, or to achieve a specific political goal. But for me, it's about the people who are involved in these movements, right? Like, the people who are caught in the middle of these movements, the individuals who are being fired at, who have the 1,000-yard stare, who just accept this as their reality. Like, we don't get to hear those stories often in the media. We don't get to connect with the child who is an aspiring doctor or lawyer, who speaks 4 or 5 languages, right? So for me, I choose my work based on how I can best serve the individuals who are in the moment, right, for the greater good and the greater cause of healing humanity in general. Even in my approach, I've had unprecedented access to groups and organizations that most people would run far, far, far away from, right? Because they want their story told. They want their story told. At the end of the day, they're human beings and they want their story told. So I try to tell those stories. I try to choose stories that are, like I said, near and dear to my heart, but also in the case of potential, white supremacist stuff, I'm Black, Jewish, like, like, I particularly am not fond of Nazis. Yes, that's very, very true. But I also want to understand what drives individuals to join these types of movements, right? Like, what is the deeper story here? Because no one just wakes up one day and says, I want to be a Nazi. Well, maybe they do. But, like, what are the factors that drove you to this? And then when you're in these moments and in these situations, how do you behave? How do you act? What are the things that drive your passion? Like, these are the things that create stories to me. Like, and that is what I'm trying to tell. I'm trying to tell stories so people can have a deeper understanding for either research purposes, for their own safety, for their own growth, their own personal growth. I feel like those are the things that are super important when it comes to me choosing the types of projects that I do. I go where people don't go. That's really what I want to do, and how I want to continue to live my life as a photojournalist.
Well, do you want to tell us about this?
Sure. So
Yeah.
domestic conflict. So, I mean, we all remember 2010, well, 2008, really, after the election of Barack Obama. The Tea Party became a thing. It really became a thing, like really quick. There's a lot of resistance to the policies that Barack Obama was well, just him being elected in general. People weren't happy. And there was a big controversy in New York. I don't know if you remember, but there was the Ground Zero Mosque. This is kind of the first time that I started training my lens on domestic issues of conflict specifically, right? Like, how are we interacting with one another on a daily basis? What are the hotbed political issues, and how far are people willing to go to express their disdain at whatever this particular, whatever they trained their lens on at the moment. So the Ground Zero Mosque controversy popped up. There was a huge kind of resurgence in xenophobia that we saw around 2010, particularly directed at Muslims for the most part, coming out of rhetoric that was being shared by the Tea Party. Now, that type of rhetoric was very disconcerting to me because, as you know, I mean, we can look at groups of individuals who have been demonized in mass from a historical perspective, and we see how that ends up. It reminded me of some of the xenophobic rhetoric that was happening during the time of in the 1930s, right? Like leading up to the Holocaust, and it very much was concerning. And not only was it Muslims, but it was also at this time in particular immigrants from Central and South America, right, and Mexico, who were kind of being lobbed into this, all immigrants are bad. They're the ones that caused this financial crisis. Now they're trying to build this mosque, right? So this organization called the Stop the Islamization of America, which was founded by Pamela Geller and Geert Wilders, a far-right politician from Holland, decided to come to New York and protest the idea of this mosque, which actually wasn't really a mosque. It was a community center, an Islamic community center that was going to be built not too far from Ground Zero, which was hallowed ground. And that was all they kept saying is, this is hallowed ground. Like, these people don't belong here. They shouldn't be in America, let alone should they ever have the opportunity to build a mosque next to Ground Zero. So this was kind of the first time that I went there. I documented conflict. I was shocked. I was really, really shocked at how much vitriol, how much hate, how much anger, and understandably, I'm a New Yorker myself. I grew up in New York. I saw the Twin Towers every day of my life going to school. I visited the Twin Towers a number of times on field trips. My best friend on 9/11 had just gotten a job at the Twin Towers, and fortunately missed the train that morning. So for me, it was an issue that I felt deeply connected to. Once again, when we talk about things that I choose to go and document, right? Like as a New Yorker, I was devastated on 9/11, absolutely devastated. But I wanted to see how much hate, how much vitriol could be, and I think this was year 9. This was before the 10th anniversary. Yeah, 2010. So I took my camera and I went to go document. And it was quite the experience. I'd never experienced people so angry. Now, mind you, as I mentioned before, when I go into a space, I don't interject. I'm not there to be political, right? Like, I'm there to tell the story in the most honest and effective way that I can. And you can't do that if you're being non-objective in this moment. But I just remembered, like, the pleasure. I love this photo, even though it's completely out of focus and blurry. Like, I love this photo because it it was a precursor to social media. Wasn't really a thing, like, majorly. Instagram definitely wasn't. And everybody didn't have a cell phone, right? Like, to hold up and document. But, like, here we are, we have folks with, kind of like the point and shoot digital cameras, and like, you know, like the news agencies around, and there's this woman just smiling, like just getting so much glee out of this confrontation that's happening like right in front of my face, right? And you have all these folks just gawking, and like it really made me feel like, my God, this is bad. Where are we headed? Where are we headed right now? Why are we yelling at each other in the streets of New York over the right of people to immigrate to this country, right? Like, and why do we have so much pleasure? Like, how is this such an amusing kind of a thing for folks? And that woman's smile on her face, and kind of her the gentleman in the middle there, and the gentleman standing there, they both just were so amused, and I never forgot that, and it was cause for great concern to me.
Mm.
And then, of course, on the other side, you know, this guy was a revert. He really had never been, he just converted to Islam, but he didn't know that you couldn't have tattoos in Islam. So the first thing he did when he converted was ran out and got a tattoo of Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah, which is like the creed to Islam, right? And, but like, technically he couldn't have it. So, but he was also there, just like fiery fighting, like on behalf of what he believed in, even though he didn't, you know, he just converted. So fast forward, Ferguson happens, right? The killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, I had been in Ferguson about a week before Mike Brown was shot, visiting some friends for the first time. I had never been to Missouri. And as soon as the event happened, because of my immediate connection to Ferguson, having been there only a week prior, I got on a plane and I went to Missouri. I went to Missouri to go and document kind of the blossoming movement, which is really, you know, born out of frustration, a significant amount of frustration. You know, we had seen the killing of Trayvon Martin. We'd seen the killings of Tamir Rice. We'd seen, you know, and I mean, of course, just throughout historically, it's just been happening. Like police have been shooting Black people, unarmed Black people, for as long as the police department has been like around. So, but this seemed different to me. It seemed as if we'd reached kind of this fever pitch moment in history, where people said, we're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to do this, right? And they started to respond in the ways that they did. I found it really important to be there. These photos of a woman standing there holding the American flag in front of this line of police in front of the Ferguson Police Department in one of the nights that was so highly viewed. And she has the shirt on that says "Hands up, don't shoot," right? Like, and it felt like such a surreal moment to just stand there and watch her hug and hold this American flag and still like hold tight to these values and believe in her country and believe that like this country could still be something better by literally holding its flag, right? Like, while begging public servants to not shoot them. Like, you know, like it felt crazy. And you can just kind of see these police like standing there in the background, this long line of police in the background, just peering off into the crowd. One of the things that was really shocking about this was it reminded me of being in Palestine. It reminded me of being in a place that had checkpoints where even the local populace couldn't even get to their homes at certain times without going through a rigorous like checkpoint process. And it was a moment where I was again like, holy crap, is this America? like what is happening? Why am I starting to feel the same things that I feel when I'm overseas, documenting things that I know I can leave, but this is home, right? Like, this is home for me. Like, there's nothing that I can do to escape this reality, because this is my reality now. This is my community's reality. And it's important to me that I tell these stories in an honest and truthful way. So that brings me to the Confederate monuments and the documentation of white supremacy. So, and really briefly, I won't hold too much time, but in New Orleans, there was a huge debate around the removal of Confederate monuments. It was well overdue, and the community just took a stand and said, we're not going to do it anymore. We're not going to look at these monuments every day. If you don't take them down, we're going to tear them down ourselves. So the mayor of New Orleans at the time, Mitchell Andrew, and the city council held a very large public meeting That was very fever pitched. And the decision came from Mayor Landry's office to remove some of the key Confederate monuments around town. Those would be the monuments to Jefferson Davis, to Beauregard, Robert E. Lee, and also one that a very racist organization called the Citizens League put up that literally was a monument to white supremacy. It said it on the base of the monument. So people weren't happy about this. This is folks who really believe that the Confederacy, of course, due to the lost cause narrative that was pushed out post-Civil War, that these were great heroes of the city of New Orleans, right? Or had some connection to the city of New Orleans due to their fervor as it relates to them fighting for the Confederacy and giving their lives, or just, these are monuments to their leaders, right? So it didn't come easy. The decision didn't come easy. There was a lot of intimidation for contractors, to the point of where I think someone set a contractor's Lamborghini on fire during this process. But fast forward to 2017 in New Orleans, the statues finally start coming down. This causes people to lose their mind all across the country. And now also back up a little bit. The conversation really took off after the shootings that occurred in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina, with Dylann Roof. A lot of cities started talking about removing these monuments to the Confederacy, and subsequently other monuments to white supremacy as well. So this made everyone angry, but New Orleans was kind of the hotbed. It was the center. Cities like New Orleans, Charlottesville, Richmond, these were the places where it seemed to be kind of the craziest. And New Orleans started bringing them down in May of 2017, which attracted the attention of white supremacists, neo-Confederates, and individuals who just were dead set on not allowing their history to be quote unquote erased. So this gentleman's name is Ken Parker. He's a member of the National Socialist Movement, which is a neo-Nazi organization. And he was there on this day. They all came into town for a battle. Literally, they called it the Battle of New Orleans. And it was well attended by the KKK, neo-Nazis, et cetera, but also some surprising faces, right? Some surprising pro-Confederacy faces, right? Like, I was really shocked to see a number of people of color that were extremely pro-Confederacy. This is Arlene Barnum, who's one of the most staunch pro-Confederacy advocates in the country, who is at the center of so many interesting moments in my life as of late. But I found it really just fascinating to tell the story honestly, right? Like, to be like, look, there are these like Black Southern folks who also are strangely like indebted or in love with the Confederacy, which was just very, very bizarre to me. But they showed up here for what turned out to be a bloody battle, a genuine bloody battle of fights and just pure Nazi Klan fervor being spread. This person was particularly of interest to me because, you know, her name is Jenna from Florida, and she wore she's Jewish as well, and like has an Israeli flag like pin right next to her Confederate flag, which just seemed to defy like logic to me, but I wasn't there to like judge. And I spent a lot of time with this individual just to try to understand what it was that she was trying to do and what the story was that she was trying to tell. This is a member of the KKK that was there that day as well, who also wanted to take a picture with me and like put his arm around me and thought he was, you know, trying to be my best friend. I respectfully declined. But this movement started to spread, right? So social media, rumor mill starts popping up. At this point, they've defined a very specific enemy known as Antifa, or anti-fascist, right? Like the anti-fascist movement known as Antifa. So someone put up a fake Antifa page and said they were going to pull down the statue of Sam Houston, which then led to the response of thousands of armed patriots coming to defend the statue, but it was also littered with white supremacists. But this is like a really interesting moment. This day in particular was a really fascinating moment because it really showed the difference of ideology and groups and how it's not a monolith, right? Like how none of this is ever a monolith. Like we never know exactly what motivates these individuals or why they're there, right? So on this day, we had people who were just strictly Texas patriots who believed that that statue of Sam Houston that you see there in the background on horseback, like, is, if anybody takes that down, they're disrespecting Texas, and we're Texas patriots, and like, that's what we're here for. We're not here for Confederate flaggers. We can't stand them. We hate the Confederate flag, like, but this is Texas. And that's actually what the rally was called, is This is Texas.
Hmm.
Then you had, and this is a member of a white nationalist organization called Vanguard America, who was very controversial. I mean, they are very openly fascist, and their leadership today runs one of the most hardcore white supremacist organizations with the largest number of membership in the country. And then, of course, here's Arlene again, right, who showed up in Houston with her Confederate flagger friends, right? And these are folks who just believe in their right to fly the Confederate flag. They don't see it as a symbol of hate. Heritage, not hate, is the thing that they say. But again, the white supremacists had choice words for them. They hated them, and the people from This Texas hated them, right? And the This Texas folks hated the white supremacists. So again, and this is an example of one of the Texas patriots on his gun there. You can see the Texas flag on his side rail on the AR-15.
Hmm.
And this guy ended up beating up a Nazi that day because they came and walked in front of him, and he thought it was the greatest insult that he could have ever seen. And he got in a huge fight with a physical altercation with one of the neo-Nazis that were there in white supremacist organizations. And then I went to Memphis. Again, people who are Confederate flaggers who really believe in the right to share their history.
I actually heard some conversations with the mayor of New Orleans when he was kind of recounting the debates in New Orleans about the monuments. And what I thought was particularly important about how he was communicating it, that it was contemporary, in the sense that it was important now to make a clear demonstration from the community, from the space, that this is a place of belonging, and that these monuments were antithetical to that. But at the same time, he was also very clear to make a historical argument too, about when these statues were actually put up, what they meant, and correcting the notion that these were from the Civil War moment, for example. I think he said something like 75 to 80% were not, in fact, were actually 20th century statues. But what this also brings up for me, because you live in these spaces, you work in these spaces, and I'm wondering if you make similar to decisions as you do when you're global, when you're in these global communities versus when you're in these communities that you are living and working. Do you think differently about it? And I'm sure you bring global experience to these moments,
Sure.
because these are the people that maybe you're already having dinner with, right? In some instances.
Right. Yeah. And I think that I do, though. I think that I do pull from those moments and those experiences that I have abroad. Right. But this is my community. Like I said earlier, this is not somewhere I can escape. I live here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So with that comes an added level of danger, right? An added level of situational awareness that I can leave behind me when I leave a war zone overseas. Like when I get on that plane, it's over for me. My life is not necessarily in danger unless someone tries to fly to America and get me. You know what I mean? Like here, I don't know who knows my face. I don't know who knows my work. I don't know what to expect around the next corner. And a lot of this work has been so dangerous and has brought so much strife into my life and has brought moments of pure anxiety and fear and sadness and depression, because it is home. It's home. It's where I lay my head at night. For instance, this gentleman here in the photo, his name is Billy Roper, one of the most hardcore white supremacists you'll ever meet, who will tell you that the Holocaust was right, and he'll call you the N-word to your face and tell you why there needs to be a white ethno state, that you should be eliminated. And they use terms like the final solution, like or the Jewish question, or all of these types of things. So in my experience, when I'm in hotel rooms with individuals like this, and there are guns laying on the bed, and folks who I know do not like me, right? Like, I'm always wondering, I'm like, are these people going to follow me home? This is in Memphis, right? So in Memphis, actually, I did get followed, right? Like I left and I made it a point, every time I do this, I make it a point to stay at a hotel that's kind of far away from the action because I don't want to get followed, right? Particularly when it comes to white supremacists or or neo-fascist stuff. But I decided to leave my hotel like about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to drive back home. And I noticed somebody sitting in the parking lot, right? Like, and I was like, okay, that's not weird or anything. Like, they could probably be leaving. But on my ride home, this truck followed me like all the way back into North Mississippi from Memphis, and then tried to run me off the road at like 6 a.m. And that was like a moment for me. And I was by myself. I had no one else there with me, right? Like no one to say, hey, like this is happening, but that's the risk. Those are the types of risks that you take. Even in this work, I've been sued, like there was a principal in New Orleans who was an ardent white supremacist who was showed up to the Battle of New Orleans rally that I spoke of a few minutes ago, wearing a skull ring and a black iron cross. The skull ring he claims was a Mexican sugar skull ring, but it looked more like a Totenkopf. If you put those two things together, and this is a moment where you talk about ethics, right? Like what is okay for you to report on and how do you report on it? Like, and what is the cost, especially if there could be a potential cost to someone, right? Like in their personal lives. Now, this person was the principal of an alternative school, which, alternative schools are predominantly, well, this one is 100% Black, right? So all of his students were Black students. And here is this guy out here with a shield that says, come and take it in Greek, and, spouting Nazi things. And then going back to be the primary administrator for a school of a vulnerable population of Black kids that this is their last chance to get it right. So it makes you think of how are these people embedding themselves in society every day, right? I chose to tell that story. I chose to tell who this individual was and what the potential threat was to my community, because in that moment, that was what was most important to me. I had to tell this story. And he ended up suing me for $10 million, threatening my life. Afterwards, I've gotten a number of death threats. They came and threw things through my window. They stole a flag off of my house. So I mean, the risks inherently are greater in these moments where you're here, and there might be someone who has a vendetta against me who still is waiting, right? Like who's just waiting for the right moment. But that doesn't mean that we stop telling these stories, because these stories are critically important in my community. And the truth has to be told either way. Like without a spin, the truth always has to be told. And because we owe that as journalists, we owe that to you. We owe that to the viewer. We owe that to the general public, because you're relying on us to tell these stories in an honest way that lets you make informed decisions about how you operate in life. And to me, I think that we've lost so much of that in journalism that it's critically important that a new school of journalists come behind what we've seen in recent times and reinstitute that level of having ethics and believing in our purpose as journalists. That is one of the most important things that we can do, is tell these stories in honest and truthful ways, no matter what the risk may be. And not everyone is willing to take the same types of risks that I do. I know that I live very dangerously, but as does anyone who does this work, but it's worth it to me at the end of the day. No matter what happens, it's worth it, because I have an opportunity to tell and inform my community about what potential threats may be, who the individuals who you may have thought were threats, who may not be threats, and just provide a level of clarity that I hope is life-changing for individuals, right? Like, let's change our minds away about the ways that we think about specific individuals. Let's try to build bridges. Let's try to understand one another at our base level of humanity and be the beautiful human beings that we all are capable of being, right? Like, I think that journalism helps us see people in ways that we never would have seen before. And then we get to the movement for Black Lives. Of course, again, which seemingly is a never-ending story. Another unarmed Black man, this time George Floyd, was shot and killed. And I'd never seen a response. Now, I've been a part of many protests in America, but I'd never seen quite the global response to a movement in the way that folks kind of galvanized around the shooting of George Floyd. And this is really, for me, I feel like this was really a moment where I artistically connected with my community, right? Like, I wanted to tell the story in such a visually compelling way that like would allow for people to feel it, to feel like you were there and try to understand. This individual is a member of the Boogaloo Boys, who is a kind of a libertarian anti-government organization. But he was showing up to these Black Lives Matter protests, and I was really curious about his presence there. And, you know, I wanted to frame him in front of city government because he's so anti-government. He's carrying this distressed American flag that's upside down. I just felt like it was such a powerful statement to see him standing there like this. He was also fully armed on these days, which made some people uncomfortable, understandably so, right? But I wanted to tell his story. This was the taking of Interstate 10 in New Orleans, where the protests just went up a ramp and took over the interstate, which on the first day was very shocking to me, to see the police response, which was very tempered. It even ended strangely in a hug, someone hugging a police officer on the interstate, and then everyone dispersed. This photo is of Dawn. Dawn was an integral figure that day. She ran up in front of everyone and stopped all of the vehicles and turned around, and I captured this moment of her yelling at the crowd to stop and just stand still and wait for these vehicles to stop. And she turned her back to these vehicles like while they were still moving, right? Like, which was just like the most powerful thing. I was like, the fearlessness of that. Like, I really want to be able to show those types of moments, right? And then this was a baby who was in a car that got stopped on that day, right? Like, and as everyone was walking by, the baby just held his fist out, like, and everybody kept fist bumping him. And then this photo, this is one of my favorite photos I've ever taken. It's of Dawn, again, the same young woman that you saw. Now, this is the second night. They went to go take the interstate again. This time they were met with an overwhelming police response where protesters were tear gassed on a high-rise bridge that had no guardrails, which could have ended terribly bad. And they were doing the same thing they did the day before. So they thought, hey, look, this is a way for us to get our voices heard. But unfortunately, it was not. It was, but it was met with just pure brutality from the police. Now, as this was happening, I snuck behind the police line as they were tear gassing and starting to beat people. And I took this photo right before a police officer put his boot in my back and kicked me down to the ground. Again, this is my local police department, right? Like, at any point, these guys could see me on the street and remember me as the guy that like snuck around behind them to get this photo, which is also very nerve-wracking. This is shortly after we were all tear gassed. And I had my gas mask on. This is one of my favorite photos because I had my gas mask on and I couldn't see anything. Or actually, I struggled to get my gas mask on and I couldn't see anything. And I finally got it on, and there are two little holes. I have an Israeli gas mask. It has two little holes that you can barely see out of. And this is about like knowing your body and your camera and how it works. And like, you know, I felt like I was one. It was almost like I was in a trance this night, you know, it was almost like I was possessed through this work. And I just remember holding my camera up and not really being able to focus, not really being able to see. And you can see kind of the tear gas dispersing around us, and snapping this photo. And like, getting back home and seeing this was just like such a magical moment for me because it was just such a vivid display of like how everyone felt that evening, right? Like, why did you do this to us? Like, this is something that we saw in Tahrir Square in Egypt, right? Like, this doesn't happen on American streets. And then, of course, the inherent threat of like bodily threat and harm of putting yourself in these types of situations, right? The police officer, I'll never forget, this police officer said, "I'll fucking shoot you," excuse the language, right? And like he pointed his weapon at me. If I had gotten hit at close range with the tear gas canister, it would have killed me, right? But I still chose to show this moment, to tell that story of how unreasonable the police were on that evening, right? Even towards members of the press. And I wasn't the only one who was threatened on that evening. Again, Dawn trying to convince someone in front of the police line that it's not worth it, right? Like, don't don't engage with them in that way. And I just always found this to be very compelling. But here's some video. And this is where like being a conflict journalist kind of makes me hardened. Like in the moments, I don't care. Like any of this bodily harm is like potentially happening to me. I'm just kind of numb and moving through it and trying to tell the story in the best way that I can. So what you'll see is me up front taking that photo, and everyone else being gassed and running, but me just kind of being like, oh, okay.
Considerably in the past couple of seconds, and now we have just seen something. That was getting close to me.
Just picking my camera back up. Cheap shooting, I guess. So yeah, I mean, you know, conflict. Again, we had a U.S. representative here who threatened a group called the NFAC, the Not Fucking Around Coalition, which is a Black militia that started showing up after these armed shootings, right? These unarmed shootings of Black men all over the country. So they'd show up and they'd make a show of force. So they all, one of the representatives said, I'll drop 10 of you. I'll drop 10 of you if you show up here in Lafayette. So they showed up in Lafayette. They all showed up as a show of force, but there was a white militia known as the Cajun militia there to meet them. Which became a very, very tense situation. And a lot of the members of the Louisiana Cajun militia have been directly tied to white supremacist organizations. And you could just see the standoff. Like, I love this photo because it's literally them standing off, right? Like just staring at one another.
You know, some of the debates in the summer of 2020 were around representing people in protest and what responsibility we had to taking care of those protesters, what responsibility the media had in representing what was authentically happening. I thought that NPR actually had a really robust discussion online about like the role of photographs in these instances. And to me, it also opens up the conversation about photographs having a different power in the world than, say, words do. And I wonder if you could respond to that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's so one of the things about documenting protests, right, is if you want to protect the individuals that you're also trying to tell a story for, right? Like, so one of the things from an ethical perspective, like I always ask folks if it's okay to publish their image when I approach them, especially in these moments where I can't really build a rapport with individuals that I don't know because everything's just happening so fast and so quick and it's so fluid. But it's really important to do that. You know, we saw government agencies going after folks. Like we've seen that even with what happened in the January 6th insurrection, right? Like a lot of these folks were identified through video and media. And of course, there's the public domain conversation, like whatever you're doing in the public, like you may as well expect it to be seen. But I always try to approach people in a way that like respectfully requests whether or not that they're okay with their photos being used in these types of ways. And can you just remind me one more time of the second part of your question?
Oh, the power of photographs, that their differences to, you know, having described these experiences just in words.
Right. Absolutely. I think it's like we're visual creatures, right? Like as human beings, we're visual creatures. I think that we often try to visualize, like when we're hearing these stories, when we're reading things, like, but there's nothing like seeing it, right? Like we look at kind of some of the great photos of history, right? Like that have literally changed like the conversation and the idea around what it means to be in these moments. You know, you think of the Warsaw Boy, right? Like, which was kind of one of those iconic photographs that made people understand the depth of the Holocaust, right? Here's this young boy, like in these German Nazi soldiers in the background, like peering at him. And it's this young boy with his arms up, you know, and like, it was something that was etched in the minds. It made people realize the severity of the situation, right? Like we think of the execution that Eddie Adams like shot, right? Like in Vietnam, right? Like here's this, you know, North Vietnamese general, like, or officer shooting someone. And like he captured the exact moment that, you know, this is graphic, but the bullet went into the gentleman's head and you see this other person wincing in the background, right? Or the napalm girl. I mean, these are all things that changed the course of it. The Battle of Antietam, right? Like being the first time that anyone had ever photographed dead bodies in in war, right? Like this is the first time people got to see what it looked like on the front, like of dead bodies. Like, and there's this idea of like, it's interesting because especially Antietam in particular, there were two people there on that day. You know, there was the artist who was drawing for the paper, right? Like who was drawing out the battle scene, and you have these artist depictions of it, and then you have these like real grimy truth photos that shocked the nation. No one had ever seen anything like it. Nobody had ever seen the bloated bodies laying in the ditch. You know, like it changes people's minds. We connect with it in a way emotionally that we otherwise just wouldn't be able to through words, or even sometimes through film. It's different because the narrative changes, and depending on how the storytelling is, there's somebody telling you a story in film, right? Like for a specific purpose, right? Like, but in a photograph, it's left up to interpretation and allows for you to really resonate. It allows for the viewer to allow it to resonate within inside of their heart and their soul, right? And there are just images that I know all of us have seen that are etched in our mind forever. And I think that that's what the power of photography and photojournalism in particular kind of offer this world. And hopefully, you know, it continues to tell stories in a way that allows people to change their hearts and their minds and brings a better condition for all of us. Yeah. So COVID. This is some of my more recent work, of course. I've been covering kind of vaccine hesitancy, as well as the impact of COVID on Black seniors across the Deep South. And you can kind of see the progression of my work, like from the beginning stuff that I showed you. And like, this is some of the work that I'm most proud of. And interestingly enough, this was the hardest story I've ever covered in my life, right? Like, it's hard for me to watch elders suffering. And unexpectedly, it had an unexpected effect on me in ways that war hasn't even had, because I really felt connected to these individuals and I grew to love them. And I really wanted to photograph them in a beautiful way that kind of respected and honored who they are as individuals. And a lot of these folks were in hospice and are no longer with us, even though this was at the beginning of this year. So I've really tried to tell these stories about how community has come together to rally around these elders and support them and get them vaccinated and provide them with the resources necessary to live a comfortable life for as long as they possibly could. Oops. I love this photo because this is a photo of a caretaker who had brought one of their elderly patients to get vaccinated in Baton Rouge at the community health center. And before it was over, you know, people were trying to convince her to get vaccinated as well. They're like, well, if you're the caretaker, you should probably also get vaccinated. And like, you know, she was just like so nervous and worried about the needle, right? And I caught her in this moment of pulling her mask down. And she was like, oh, I hate needles, right? But I love this moment, like, because it was just like such an honest moment for her. She was so stressed out about like taking this shot. And
it's so relatable too.
Right, exactly. So this is the woman that she caretakes for, right? Who lives by herself, like has lived in her home in Baton Rouge for 80 years continuously, and has no, you know, her son lives in another state, but this caretaker comes and takes care of her every day. And like, this is it made me break down when I took the photo, you know what I mean? Because it's just, I think at this point we'd been in about a year. This is in March of this year. So we've been going through the pandemic for about a year, and we just knew kind of like what it meant for an elder to get, you know, COVID, or, and then just also this idea of like solitude and being alone in moments like this. So it felt really powerful to me. But then having this wonderful caretaker who's like willing to literally do anything to like make sure that this person is comfortable. I went to rural Alabama to meet with communities about vaccine hesitancy, and discovered that everyone in the rural communities have been vaccinated already, which was really fascinating to me. And I took this at a rest stop. This gentleman was playing poker, and we sat down and we talked, video poker, and we sat down and we talked and really had a great conversation about why he got it. And like his quote to me was, "It's not a game," right? And I just loved it because we're sitting in front of these gaming machines, right? And like it just felt great. And I love this photo. It's one of my favorites that I've ever taken as well.
Mm.
But this was the general store in the town. It's the
Mm.
only store in the town of Panola, Alabama. And this woman was fantastic because it's about, again, photojournalism is about connecting with people and hearing their stories and telling their stories in a way that like help people connect to it, right? Like this person was on the phone with every person in small Panola, calling them, "Did you get your vaccine yet? Did you get your vaccine yet?" And I just loved her for it. She was running the general store that day, but she was also running like the public health, like, like campaign to make sure that the entire community was vaccinated and safe. So my new projects are Africatown. I shot this for Der Spiegel, which is a German publication out of Hamburg. And so I grew up in New York, but we moved to Alabama when I was, and this comes back to the question of like, how do you choose your stories and how do you, like tell the stories that are connected to you in certain ways. My parents moved us to Alabama in my freshman year of high school from New York, which was a kind of culture shock for me. But my father had previously lived in Alabama and had gone to school in a community called Plateau. He'd always talked about this school, Mobile County Training School, which was a segregated school in the segregated community of Plateau. Little did I know about the history of Plateau and Africatown, as it's called. Africatown was founded by enslaved people who were aboard the Clotilda, which was the last slave ship to ever enter the United States in 1860. This is 5 years before the end of slavery. There was a bet by the Mayer family in Mobile that they could bring in a ship of slaves. So they hired a schooner to go to Benin, where they knew there was an active slave trade still. And they captured 100 enslaved people and brought them back to Mobile and docked in a little part of Mobile north of the Mobile Bay. And for years, it was said that this was completely false. Members of the community in Africatown had been trying to get some form of reparation from the Mayer family for a number of years. They said the ship didn't exist. What are you talking about? So there's no way, if there's no evidence that there's a ship, then there's no possible way. So in 2019, they found the ship. They found the wreckage to the Clotilda. Surprisingly, right next to the Mayer family trapping camp, who set the boat on fire and sunk it literally right next to the family camp. So I went and met with members of the families, descendants of the families that were there in Africatown. And Africatown this is a story that I'm going to continue to tell beyond Der Spiegel as well, because it's just so near and dear to me. I brought up my father earlier because I found out that the school that he went to was in Africatown, right? So Mobile County Training School was a major player, a major part of this community. And it was founded because of these enslaved people who built this beautiful community that has been systematically erased and destroyed over the years. This is the church that was built there shortly after the end of slavery. And, it's a community that has an immense amount of pride. But again, we're talking about the Clotilda. This is Ben Raines is the journalist who initially discovered the shipwreck. And he got no credit for it. He had to fight to get credit because National Geographic claimed to have discovered it themselves, which was just false, but then they retracted it. So this is 12 Mile Island, where the ships was set afire, and this is the Mayer family camp. And where you see this little red sign here to the right, there is the location of the Clotilda wreckage. But the enslaved people were brought to this swamp, to this area, and offloaded in a place that has alligators, and they were made to wait there for a full, I think it was either a day to 48 hours naked. while they figured out ways to split up their cargo and ship them off to various plantations. This is at Mobile County Training School. The legend says that this is the bell that was on the Clotilda, but that's kind of been dispelled. But people still hold tight, close to it. And as you can see, it's just kind of the center of the idea and community there. Africatown is poverty stricken beyond belief. It's one of the poorest places I've been in America. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Mayer family still owns a considerable amount of portion, and industry has come in and built ports all around Africatown. And also they built an interstate directly through the middle of the city, which ultimately led to the end of it. And then most recently, my most recent project now is focusing on the river parishes post-Hurricane Ida. As you know, Hurricane Ida hit 16 years to the day that Hurricane Katrina did in Louisiana, and completely devastated parts of the river parishes, and even caused significant damage here in the city of New Orleans as well. I'm focusing on Pointe-à-Chêne in Ironton. Ironton is a historically Black community that has a history very much like Africatown, in the sense that they faced a significant amount of environmental racism, and plants and a number of different types of industries have been built. They're trying to build a port there right now. Oil companies have come in and bulldozed over cemeteries and all those types of things. And this is another, it's kind of the final nail in the coffin. Judge Leander Perez, who a street is named for in the neighboring St. Bernard Parish, was an ardent segregationist, and kind of like I would say almost a mob boss. He ran the parish for Plaquemines Parish, where Ironton is located, for quite some time, and just did everything possible to keep that community down. So, but these are some images from Pointe-à-Chêne, which is an indigenous community that is down in the river parishes, and you can just see kind of some of the absolute devastation that has occurred down there. So we're trying to keep this story alive and allow for people to continue to connect and understand the need and important need for mutual aid, and importance of continuing to help this community get back on its feet. So that's the project that I'm currently working on, and that's it for now.
It kind of brings us full circle to the question about aftermath and media really thinking about what happens afterwards, after a moment, right? And that's just an incredible example of that. I wanted to end with a conversation that we've been having since last fall about citizen photojournalism, which you mentioned earlier, and we brought it up in our current exhibition on photojournalism as well. And that is, to kind of loosely define citizen photojournalism, this is going to be a member of the public who is neither affiliated nor employed by an official media outlet, right? And that these are people who are collecting information, collecting images, reporting, circulating, and in some instances, we talk about it coming out of the community, right? And opening up the opportunity for what voices are included. And then there's, of course, another side of that where it doesn't go through editors anymore. It doesn't go through the media outlets, which of course in itself has this history of being monolithic, and a history of gatekeeping of what narratives are being told and how. And I think it's a complex, but also important and maybe exciting opportunity for journalism, or the landscape of journalism. And I'm just curious about your relationship to that, to citizen photojournalism, your impression of it, what you've thought about it, and also how you see it maybe changing or influencing, and I would say in a way that's an opportunity too for photojournalism.
Absolutely. So, I started as a citizen photojournalist, right? Like as a citizen journalist. Like I called myself a photojournalist all day, but I wasn't reporting for any major outlet. And this is in the days of Blogspot, I created a blog that was called For the People, right? Like, and all the work that I was doing, all the coverage that I was filming and taking photos of, like, I would put that on my blog so that people could have an idea of what was going on from the inside, right? Like from a community member's perspective. you know, and then I moved on and started working for media outlets and like was fortunate enough to have that opportunity. But like ultimately at the end of the day, it was about the dissemination of information to my community so that they can make the best decisions possible for themselves, right? To ensure that they had all of the accurate, honest, clear information. And that was what opportunities or websites at the time like Blogspot or all of these other things, Facebook even, afforded us the opportunity to do. I think it's great. I think it's great. I was just in a room the other day on an app called Clubhouse where we have discussions and with a number of different photojournalists, organizations, photographers. And, you know, there was a huge conversation around like, what does it mean that like folks can take a cell phone picture and now that can like, you know, be as impactful as an Eddie Adams photo, you know what I mean? Like, you know, we think about citizen journalism as it relates to the George Floyd video, right? Like these are people with a cell phone who are out just documenting and recording what's happening in front of them and then disseminating that information at light speed, literally light speed, and changing the discourse and conversation around particular issues hotbed issues that we've been trying to understand for years and years and years and decades, that major media outlets haven't had the opportunity to, have never been successfully able to like push people forward on, right? So I think it's incredible. I think it's important. I think that as a photographer, I often hear, as I was saying, some of these photographers are very much to their chagrin. Like they don't like the idea that someone with a cell phone can create a compelling image and have as much of an impact because they've invested for the most of their life in like equipment and like, you know, building their careers. And like, that means that there's less opportunities for money. And like, you know, it's hard to make a living as a photojournalist these days, but like, I think that when you tell stories in a compelling way, it doesn't matter what the medium it is, right? Medium is. And like, if there have been so many stories that I've tried to tell and that I've pitched to organizations, media outlets that were critically important to me and to my community and to the greater community at large, right? But they weren't interested in telling those stories, right? Because they weren't sexy enough. They weren't sensationalized. They were just the plain, honest truth, showing what it is, for what it is, you know what I mean? And like, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And I think that that's incredible. If I can't pitch a story, if I shoot something and I pitch it and it doesn't go out, I can post it on my Instagram and it can be shared thousands of times or it could be shared 2 times, right? But like, as long as the impact that I've made reaches someone, if one person's mind changes around these issues, that's all that I care about, right? Like if one white supremacist sees himself on my Instagram feed and is like, I'm an asshole, like that's what matters to me, because like it creates an opportunity for us to see the world in an honest and open and genuine way. Like, and the message is not diluted. There's not an editor there changing the story to fit the photo in the way that they deem is the appropriate way to tell these stories. You have these individuals, and a lot of them are young folks, right? Like, who are just telling their own stories and taking control of their own destinies. And there's nothing more powerful than that. There's nothing more powerful than that. It's changed the landscape of photojournalism and journalism in general forever. Unless these tools are taken away, which they could be. They could also be completely taken away at a moment's notice, right? But unless that happens, like, we now have the ability to tell our own stories and to have a diverse set of voices at the table, right? Telling these stories. Historically, it's been white men who have been telling these stories. And like, now we can have the indigenous person tell their own story. We can have the trans person tell their own story. We can have like individuals engaged with movements tell the stories in ways that like accurately represent their feelings and their emotions and the ways that they're trying to connect with the community through the work that they're producing. And there's nothing to stop them. And I think that that's beautiful. I think that's a world that I want to live in. I want to hear all the voices, even the voices I don't agree with. I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. Like, we have a duty to listen to one another. And the only way that we're going to change our existence in humanity is to listen to one another, to hear from one another, to learn from one another. Even in those moments where we don't agree, where we hate each other, where we see each other as the enemy, if we can soften our hearts, open our minds, and listen to the ideas and stories that people are trying to tell about their truths, then I think that we can heal our existence. We can be in a better place. I think that we can believe in one another again. And like, that's what it's going to take. Like, we watched the power of citizen journalism through the Arab Spring, right? Like, no matter what the end result was, like, we saw people saying, I am going to tell my own story. I'm going to show the world what's happening to me, to my community, to my people. And there's nothing more powerful than that, and nothing could stop them. Their voices were heard. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, is giving the individual who will never have the opportunity to run on the front page of the New York Times the same leverage. It evens the playing field to give them the same opportunity to have their voice heard without anyone diluting their message. And I think there's nothing more powerful than that.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Abdul, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your energy and your effort and your willingness to be a part of this conversation. And it's been such a pleasure. And I've looked so forward to this. And I just appreciate it so much. I'm just deep gratitude.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much.